The first time I died, it was raining. I remember that strangely clearly, not the pain. Not the shock of the truck's headlights exploding through the intersection like a second sun. Not even the moment my body left the ground, but the rain. It had been falling for hours, the kind of steady gray drizzle that turns the whole city into a blur of reflections and quiet misery. I had left the hospital after a 14-hour shift, clutching a plastic bag that held nothing but a prescription bottle and a folded bill I had been too tired to open. My shoes were soaked through, my back ached, and my phone buzzed with another message from my husband, Andrew. "Did you transfer the money yet?" The message had come with 3 question marks and no greeting, the way all of his messages did lately. I remember standing on the curb, staring at those words, feeling a strange hollowness open in my chest because even then, after everything I had sacrificed, I still felt guilty for hesitating. Andrew had a dream after all. He always said that like it explained everything. His startup needed another round of investment, his partners were counting on him, success was just around the corner if I could just help him a little longer. I had already drained my savings once. I had sold my grandmother's jewelry. I had taken out a loan under my own name because Andrew's credit was temporarily complicated. The number he wanted this time was larger than any before, and the bill in my hand, my own medical bill, felt suddenly heavier than the rain-soaked air around me. I stepped into the street without looking up from the phone. The last thing I remember thinking was absurdly small. Maybe if the startup works, all of this will be worth it. Then the horn screamed, the headlights swallowed everything, and the rain kept falling. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight poured through a window I hadn't seen in years. I lay perfectly still for a long time, staring at the familiar crack in the ceiling above my childhood bed, feeling my heart hammer as memories slammed into each other inside my head like colliding trains. My old bedroom. The faded blue wallpaper. The desk I had used in high school, still carved with the initials I had scratched into the wood when I was 16. I sat up slowly, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone on the nightstand. The date on the screen made the air leave my lungs. 10 years earlier. 10 entire years before the rain-soaked night when I died. Before the loans. Before the exhaustion. Before Andrew's dream had devoured every corner of my life. At first I thought it was a hallucination brought on by trauma, some cruel trick my brain was playing while it shut down. But the house smelled the same as it had back then. My mother's cooking drifting up from the kitchen, the faint scent of detergent on freshly washed sheets, and when I touched the mirror above the dresser, the girl staring back at me was unmistakably my younger self. 22 years old, bright-eyed, hopeful, and painfully naive. The same girl who had once believed Andrew when he said they would build a future together. The same girl who had believed love meant sacrifice. I stared at that reflection until my fear slowly turned into something colder, something sharper. In my first life, I had given Andrew everything I had. In my second, I would give him nothing. The first time Andrew came to see me after my rebirth, he looked exactly the way I remembered him from those early years. Tall, charming, with that restless confidence that made people believe he was destined for something extraordinary. When he smiled, it was easy to forget how selfish he could be. How easily his ambitions swallowed everything else. In my first life, I had fallen for that smile before I even realized it. Now, when he walked into the small cafe near campus and waved at me from across the room, I felt nothing but a distant curiosity, like observing a stranger I happened to recognize from a photograph. He sat down across from me, talking animatedly about an idea he had been developing, a tech platform that would revolutionize logistics, though he never explained exactly how. I listened politely, sipping my coffee while memories of the future whispered quietly in my mind. I knew what would happen to this idea. I knew the investors who would eventually laugh him out of meetings. I knew the partners who would abandon him when the money ran dry. And most importantly, I knew how much of my own life he would demand to keep the illusion alive. When he finally finished speaking, his eyes bright with excitement, he leaned forward and said the words that had once changed my life. I just need someone who believes in me. In my first life, I had reached across the table and taken his hand. This time, I set my cup down gently and said, "Then you should find someone who does." Andrew stared at me as if I had spoken another language. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by a hint of irritation he tried to hide behind a laugh. "You're joking, right?" He said lightly, "You always said you believed in me." The words felt strange to hear again, like an echo from a distant room I had already left behind. I remembered how easily they had once trapped me, how I had mistaken belief for love and responsibility for devotion. But this time I simply shrugged. "I was younger then," I said. "People change." The conversation ended awkwardly after that. Andrew left the cafe with a forced smile, promising we would talk again soon, but I knew he was already recalculating the situation in his mind, searching for some way to pull me back into orbit around his ambitions. In my first life, I had been the perfect partner for a dreamer, patient, hardworking, willing to sacrifice everything for the promise of a future that never arrived. In this life, I had no intention of playing that role again. The years that followed unfolded very differently from the ones I remembered. Without Andrew's endless financial emergencies draining my savings, I finished medical school without crushing debt. Without the emotional exhaustion of constantly supporting someone else's failing ambitions, I found the energy to pursue opportunities I had once ignored. I accepted a research position at a private biotech firm, the kind of place where brilliant but obsessive people spent their nights chasing breakthroughs most of the world would never understand. The work was difficult, demanding, and sometimes isolating, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, every step forward felt like something I had chosen for myself rather than something I had sacrificed to support someone else. Occasionally I would hear fragments of news about Andrew through mutual acquaintances. His startup launched 2 years later than planned. The product never quite worked the way he promised. Investors lost patience. Partners drifted away. The pattern unfolded almost exactly the way I remembered, except this time my bank account and my sanity remained untouched by the fallout. 5 years after our conversation in the cafe, I saw Andrew again at a technology conference in San Francisco. He looked older than his age, the easy confidence I once admired replaced by a tense, brittle energy that made him seem permanently on edge. When our eyes met across the crowded networking hall, recognition flashed between us, followed by something that looked suspiciously like resentment. He approached me cautiously, as if unsure whether I would welcome him or walk away. "You look successful," he said after an awkward pause, glancing at the company badge hanging from my neck. I shrugged, offering a polite smile. "I'm doing fine." The conversation that followed was short and strangely formal. Like two distant acquaintances exchanging pleasantries at a reunion neither of them truly wanted to attend. Andrew mentioned that his company was pivoting to a new strategy. I wished him luck, then we both moved on. As I walked away, I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest, as if some invisible thread tying me to my past had finally snapped. But life, I discovered, had a strange sense of irony. 3 years later, on a cold autumn evening, someone knocked on the door of my townhouse just as I was finishing dinner. I wasn't expecting visitors, and for a moment I considered ignoring the sound entirely. But the knocking came again, slower this time, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, Andrew stood on the porch like a ghost dragged out of an old memory. For a second I barely recognized him. The sharp suits and confident posture he once carried like armor were gone, replaced by a worn jacket and tired eyes that seemed older than the man they belonged to. Rain dripped from the edges of his hair, and I couldn't help noticing how eerily similar the moment felt to the night I died in my first life. He looked at me with a mixture of desperation and embarrassment, the kind of expression people wear when they've run out of options but still hate themselves for asking. "I know it's been a long time," he said quietly, "but I need your help." In my first life, those words would have sent me scrambling to solve whatever crisis Andrew had created this time. I would have invited him inside immediately, made tea, listened to his explanation with anxious concern. Now I simply leaned against the doorframe and waited. Silence stretched between us until he finally began speaking again, haltingly at first, and then with growing urgency. His company had collapsed after a disastrous product launch. Investors were suing. Debt collectors were circling. He needed a temporary loan just enough to stabilize things until he could start over. As he spoke, the rain fell harder, drumming softly against the porch roof like a distant applause. I listened without interrupting, studying the lines of exhaustion carved into his face. This was the man I had once nearly destroyed myself to support, the man whose dream had consumed my youth. For a moment I wondered if he remembered the version of our story that only existed in my mind, the life where I had given him everything and died alone in the rain. Probably not. To him, this was simply another failed venture and another desperate request. When he finished speaking, Andrew looked at me with the fragile hope of someone who believes they are about to be saved. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes from finally understanding a lesson you once learned the hard way. No, I said gently. The word hung in the air between us like a door closing. Andrew blinked, clearly unprepared for such a simple answer. You don't understand, he insisted quickly. I'm not asking for much, just enough to get through this month. Once I get back on my feet, I raised a hand, stopping him before he could finish. I understand perfectly, I said. That's why the answer is still no. His face twisted with frustration, then disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how the girl who once believed in him so fiercely had become someone capable of turning him away. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The rain continued to fall, soaking the porch and the street beyond in a steady gray curtain. Finally Andrew let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. You used to care about me, he muttered. The accusation might have hurt once. Now it felt oddly irrelevant. I did, I admitted. But caring about someone doesn't mean destroying your own life for them. He stared at me as if trying to decide whether I had become cruel or simply honest. Maybe the difference didn't matter anymore. After another silence, he stepped back from the doorway, the fragile hope in his eyes slowly fading into resignation. I guess I misjudged you, he said quietly. I considered that for a moment, then replied, no, you just never really knew me. Andrew left without another word, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness of the street. I watched him go until his figure vanished completely, then closed the door and returned to my quiet house. For a while I stood in the kitchen listening to the rain against the windows, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had given me a second chance at my own life. In my first life, Andrew's dream had been the center of my world, the axis around which every decision revolved. In this one, it was nothing more than a distant echo, something that had once mattered deeply, but no longer held any power over me. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle into the spaces where regret had once lived. Somewhere out in the city, Andrew was probably searching for another door to knock on, another person willing to believe in a dream that had already consumed too many years. I wished him luck in the abstract way one wishes luck to strangers. But I no longer felt responsible for the outcome of his story. That burden belonged entirely to him now. And for the first time in either life, that felt exactly the way it should be.